Thank you. Thank you so much, Vince. Thank you for the nice introduction. And now we try to see if any of this works. And thank you all for tuning in, most of you online, and I appreciate that. I appreciate that you've taken the time. So thank you for coming. Now I'm going to assume you can see my title slide and you can hear me, right? I have no idea if anybody's saying or doing anything, so I'll just keep going.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right. So as Vince said, I want to talk about why any of this happens. So let's start with a very old story. What is happening in bilingual minds? Well, you've got language represented, and if you're bilingual, you've got a couple of languages represented. They are jointly activated, which means there are many occasions for conflict, but bilinguals don't get confused. So somehow there's a selection procedure. That's a story we've known for about 40 years. And every piece of that story has been demonstrated and confirmed with lots of really good psycholinguistic evidence. Now, at the same time, there's another story that was actually taking place in parallel, which is that these bilingual minds were also associated with cognitive modifications. Now, that was first reported in any kind of positive way in 1962, but more consistently since about 1980 or so, where people have, had these dedicated studies looking at monolingual and bilingual minds performing nonverbal tasks. So those two lines of research have been going on for a long time and are both based on lots of evidence. And the question is, are they related? Now, for a long time, there has been this answer, and I have to say here, I'm responsible for putting this out there, and I'm going to spend the next hour trying to backtrack. But the standard view has been, yes, they are related, and in fact, they're causally related, because what happens is that this experience in inhibiting the unwanted target language transfers to other non-linguistic situations where you have to inhibit some feature. So the standard view is a story in which inhibition transfers to other tasks. And even now, most of the research starts with that assumption, that assumed story. Now, there's a lot of evidence, and this is a kind of a map that I use to show the range of evidence we have for bilingualism. We have the lifespan with these faces. We have behavioral and imaging evidence separated by that dotted line. And within each of the cells, I've just listed the kinds of tasks people have used to demonstrate differences between monolinguals and bilinguals. So there's lots and lots of them, and I'm not going to go through them. But as you can see, they cover the lifespan, they cover research methodologies, and they use a variety of procedures. So the standard view, again, is that in all of these cases where we see bilinguals and monolinguals performing differently, particularly on nonverbal tasks, the reason is language use leads to cognitive and brain change. And in particular, inhibition of an unwanted language transfers to inhibition in nonverbal cognition. That's the standard story. But there's a problem. There's actually several problems. First, a lot of those results are inconsistent. And if it's a mechanism, you want it to be more reliable. Newton did not say an apple will sometimes fall from a tree. He said apples fall from trees. So the inconsistent results that are tied to that explanation are problematic. But more serious, I think, is that we find effects of bilingualism in places that we should not, if that transfer of inhibition story is true. And notably, preverbal infants, they don't speak. They're not inhibiting a language representation. And yet they show more advanced performance from infants raised in monolingual environments on a variety of tasks: memory, perception, and attention. In older age, and in particular, older adults with dementia who show cognitive reserve, this cannot be traced to inhibition of a language representation. It's something far broader. And finally, the large and growing, excuse that ringing phone, we're having an election here. The phone rings every 5 minutes with somebody's campaign. The broad range of brain changes found in bilinguals when compared to monolinguals, these brain changes cover the entire brain and areas and functions that really can't be traced to language use, let alone inhibition of a language. So it doesn't really fit. So if we go back to that map that I showed you, this is the range of evidence. I'm not retracting that. But these are the types of evidence that do not fit very well with that standard story, where inhibition of a language feature transfers to inhibition of some perceptual feature. Now, I'll put this one in a dotted line because you could explain the research with young adults and conflict tasks in terms of transfer. But because the results are so intermittent, it's hard to accept that as the explanation. So let's turn to the brain. The literature on bilingual brains is exploding in really interesting and productive ways. Now, we know across this range of research that differences between monolingual and bilingual brains can be found in both white matter and gray matter structure and in functional activation. So I put up this old summary piece that John Grundy was first author on, but there's much more since then. So the point here is that the changes are extensive and they're pretty well, anywhere you look, you'll find them. Second, and really important, I think, for the argument, is that they're found across the lifespan. They're found in infants, they're found in children, they're found in older adults. So this isn't something that's just tied to learning a language or using a language when you're young. These changes that seem to correspond to bilingual experience are found across the lifespan. So throughout the brain, across the lifespan, and for me, the best argument of all is they are correlated with the degree of bilingual experience. And there's our good friend Vince, who I was very privileged to be part of that study, but incredibly rich data showing that these structural and functional brain changes are correlated with degree of bilingual experience. It isn't putting people into two groups and saying something is turned on or off. This is a dynamic change that is tied to a complex experience. And again, it affects all of the brain continuously. So that's what the brain is telling us. How can we use this information from brain studies to try to understand what's going on in bilingual minds? And the hypothesis is this. The effect of bilingualism is on general, I will explain, not specific function. So inhibition is very specific. The inhibition story is that this very precise process that we can measure and monitor, that's where the action is, and it transfers. But the hypothesis here is you've got to forget about homing in on one specific function or process. The effect is general. All right, well, general in what sense? And what I'm arguing here is that the exposure at any time in life to two languages or more makes bilingual brains more efficient. What does efficient mean? And I'm going to define efficiency as better connectivity with less effortfulness required for similar output. Furthermore, this efficiency can be seen through changes in attention. So you can't see the brain. I mean, you can, I guess, see the brain, pulsing and functioning. But the proxy that I'm going to argue tells us how efficient the brain is measures of attention. So we're going to examine how attention is allocated and use that information to say something about how efficient the brain is. So these two aspects of efficiency, connectivity and effortfulness, I'm going to show you a study that addresses each of them. We begin with resting state connectivity. So as you know, the brain is not just sitting there waiting for something to happen. It's in a constant state of preparedness in that the regions of the brain are all kind of activated in ways that yield distinct networks. So correlated activities between brain regions produces networks. These are not regions of interest. These networks do not have to be physically next to each other. Instead, it's correlated activity across the brain that gives rise to these sort of meta networks. And I think here about the incredible prescience of Donald Hebb, cells that fire together, wire together. So he already had this kind of notion of, he called it a cell assembly, but that's really what a network is. It's cells that fire together that are then wired together. And because the brain is brilliant, they don't have to be side by side. So you get these correlated firings that create networks. And we know from a lot of research on these networks now that better connectivity within these networks and between the networks, so you have inter and intra network connectivity, better connectivity is associated with better cognitive function, not surprising. And the converse is that poorer connectivity is associated with poor function and disease, like Alzheimer's disease. So that's what these networks are. But the really exciting piece of it is that these resting state networks can be modified through experience. So now they're on the table as something to look at. Several studies have looked at resting state connectivity in monolinguals and bilinguals using both EEG and MRI. And all of the studies that have done this have reported better connectivity in bilinguals. I don't expect you to be able to read all of this, but it's just a table that shows a lot of people have tried this with a variety of participants using different kinds of analyses. And the results look like they're all over the place, but in fact, they're all consistent in that in all cases, the bilinguals have better connectivity. Okay, So we did a study, and this is a study that was headed by my colleague Dale Stevens, where he took data from 78 older adults who were monolingual or bilingual and matched really carefully. So take a second and look at those numbers. This is a really well-matched sample. And we have lots of data on these people because once you get them in, you sort of throw the book at them. So in this study, we're looking at resting state connectivity. This is done in MRI, not EEG, on well-matched monolingual and bilingual older adults who are all 74-ish years old, and they're the same on everything. Now, the results are analyzed in terms of graph theory analysis, which is a means of showing these correlated networks. So you get the brain activations at rest. They're lying in the scanner, but they're not doing anything. So their brains are at rest. And what you're looking for is patterns of connectivity. Studies have done this in the past and as such have identified major networks. And this is several of them here that have been studied. Now, what you see under each of the networks is the regions that contribute to those networks. And notice that the network doesn't mean that it's in one physical place in the brain. It's correlated activity across the brain. Now, the networks that we're going to look at here are these three: the default mode network, the frontoparietal control network, and the dorsal attention network. These are really important networks, and they have a very particular connection to each other. So this graph now shows them in a different way. It ignores where they are in the brain, and it just scoops out their various nodes or seeds and puts them in a structural relationship. So in the center, in green, is the frontoparietal control network. It is involved in all cognitive tasks, all of them. Whatever you're doing, you are engaging the frontoparietal control network. Now, the other two, the default mode network and the dorsal attention network, take turns. If one is on, the other is off, and vice versa. So they are anti-correlated. They're not supposed to be on at the same time, but they're always on with the FPC. So the FPC is kind of the conductor that says, okay, violins, it's your turn. Okay, shut up, violins, it's time for the clarinets, and so on. So they are anti-correlated and they're not on together. Now, with aging, a curious thing happens because the default mode network starts getting stuck to the FPC. It doesn't shut off when it's the turn for the dorsal attention. It keeps playing. It drowns out the clarinets because it doesn't stop playing. This is normal, healthy aging. The default mode network becomes locked or stuck or glued to the FPC. And when that happens, you get a decline in cognitive performance, in part because the FPC is so busy trying to deal with the default mode network, it's less available for the dorsal attention network, and you get a drop in performance in normal, healthy aging. Okay, that's aging. So we did all of these network analyses for our monolingual and bilingual sample of 74-year-olds, and here's what we found. First, there was stronger connectivity between the default mode network and the FPC in monolinguals than bilinguals. We expect this connectivity with aging. The bilinguals were showing less of it. The bilinguals were less stuck. The monolinguals have that glued default mode network thing, bilinguals less so. And these are the specific nodes that were different. And this is a way of just showing the degree of connection. So the monolinguals have significantly more connectivity between those two networks. And remember, the connectivity is not helpful. It's normal, it's just not helpful. But more important, Vince will like this one, the degree of connectivity was significantly correlated with the degree of bilingualism. So the more bilingual they are along the x-axis, more bilingual, the less stuck the default mode network was to the control network. So what you have is the default mode network is more locked to the control network in monolinguals than in bilinguals, and it is tied to the degree of bilingualism. So that's the first point, connectivity. The second point is effortfulness. How much energy is required to get to some level of performance? And I think about this in terms of a very simple analogy. Everybody can go out and walk, 100 meters. There's no problem. You can all do that. Some, but not all of you, can go out and jog 100 meters. But only a few of you can sprint 100 meters. So if you're just looking at walking, you're not going to find any individual differences that are meaningful. You have to keep making the task more difficult to find the point at which whatever resources you have are no longer sufficient. So this is kind of the effortfulness argument. Now, if you have a more efficient resource, you can take it further because you need less of it for each level of performance. So we're going to measure behavioral and electrophysiological outcomes, which is an index of effort, for monolingual and bilingual young adults performing a task that is essentially the same task, but keeps increasing its demands. It goes from walking to jogging to running. And the hypothesis is that the groups will be similar on the very easy levels, but bilinguals will achieve those outcomes with less effort, and therefore they'll have more resources to keep going to more difficult levels. And the task is NBAC. This is a task I did with my student Cognition a few years ago. And what we did is create an NBAC task that we could modify for effortfulness. So it's the same task, 0, 1, 2, and 3 back. In 0 back, the instruction is every time you see a hand or whatever, it's obviously counterbalanced, press a button. 1 back is every time you see a stimulus that you just saw in the previous trial, press a button. It's a bit confusing, but it's not terrible. 2 back, same instruction, but you've got to hold in mind the sequence for 2 consecutive stimuli. And 3 back, which is incredibly difficult, you've got to match the current stimulus to one you saw 3 trials earlier. It's the same task, it just gets harder. Here's our sample. Again, these are young adults, and again, I think you'll find they're very well matched. They're the same on everything except second language ability. So monolinguals and bilinguals, same age, same almost everything. doing this task. So the results. Let's start simply with the behavioral results. So reaction time, we can just dismiss right away. Of course, across the conditions, they get slower. But there's absolutely no difference. And what I find interesting here is that they're always really quite fast. Even in the very, very difficult 3-back, they're making decisions pretty quickly. Reaction time, of course, is only to accurate responses, to correct responses. So they're doing the task really well, and they're doing it quickly. That also tells me that reaction time isn't really giving us useful information. Now, accuracy, not surprisingly, really drops off. And the blue lines are bilinguals, the red lines are monolinguals. Everybody finds the subsequent conditions to be more difficult, but the drop off for the monolinguals is more, it's significantly steeper. But you can see that the task manipulation is having its effect. Now, for electrophysiology, what we're interested in is posterior P3s. And the message here is that a nice big positive P3 waveform is an index of easy processing for which effortful intervention is not required. So the larger the P3, the more smooth and high the P3 goes, the less effort that's recruited to perform the condition, to perform the task. All right, so here's the results. I'll take you through it. I put everything on one graph so the comparisons are easy, but I know it makes the graph messy. So I've put a box around where the P3 is, and it's actually just goes a little past 400 milliseconds. This is the amplitude of the P3. So remember, a larger amplitude means a more automatic processing, easier time. And there's two things to notice about these graphs. The first is that the blue lines are bilingual and the red lines are monolingual. And the blue lines are always higher than the red lines. In every single case, blue lines are always higher. So whatever is happening, and for whatever level of accuracy you're talking about, the bilinguals are doing it with less effort. And the other thing to notice is, now I'm sure you can't see this clearly, but I've used different kinds of dotting to show the conditions. So just take my word for it, that the conditions 0, 1, 2, and 3 follow in exactly the predicted sequence of difficulty. So this is list the series that goes from 0, 1, 2, 3. Within each language group is always in the correct order, and monolinguals are always requiring more effort than bilinguals, even when their accuracy is the same. The largest difference, though, is on the most difficult condition. So this is the 3-back, where everybody is doing more poorly. And even here, I've indicated the difference in effort required for the bilinguals and the monolinguals. So what can we say about efficiency? What I've shown here is that bilingual brains have better resting state connectivity than monolinguals. So maybe that means they're more prepared to respond. Behaviorally, in the N-back, bilinguals outperform monolinguals as the task became more difficult, so they have more endurance. And in the electrophysiology, we saw that bilinguals are using less effort to achieve the same level. So this is like more fit. You can do more with less. You don't need all that extra energy. It's like the energy efficient appliances in your kitchen. They'll still keep your food cold and they will use less energy. So that's what an efficient brain does. It can achieve the same level, it can do the task with less energy. So the interpretation that I want to make is that bilingual experience makes attention systems more efficient. Okay, how does it do that? And here's where I'm going to argue that bilingual environments lead to an adaptation in brain networks. What does that mean? So let's start by looking at the standard story. The standard view is that bilingual language processing, or a particular aspect of bilingual language processing, transfers to nonverbal tasks. So you have a skill, this is what transfer means. A skill developed in one context turns out to be really useful for a completely different context. So it's applied, it's transferred. It's the same skill that's built up in one context, and then it's reused, repurposed for a different context. And in this case, we're talking about the inhibition of language is repurposed so it can inhibit a feature in things like a Stroop, Simon, or flanker task. That's the standard view. The alternate view is that bilingual experience on its own, you're in this big soup of bilingual experience, and it's not going to lead to some specific thing that you use here and then use there, but the entire attention system is adapted to deal with this complex environment. So we have bilingual experience in which there are a whole bunch of processes that are immersed in that experience. And because there's an adaptation from that experience, the bilingual experience changes that process. And then everything that process has to do is modify. And so let's say that process is attention, selective attention. Now, just to think about this another way, we know that correlation is not causation, but that's kind of the mistake that the transfer view is making. We know there's a correlation between these things, but is it causation? Correlation doesn't answer that question, because correlation is sometimes explained by an underlying third factor. And the adaptation view is more aligned with the underlying third factor. So just being in a bilingual environment changes the system so that everything that system does is modified. Now, adaptation is a common explanation for changes in many biological systems. So just to pick up a few here, blood hemoglobin adapts to oxygen. I just read an article recently about a study conducted on people who live in extreme high altitudes in the Andes, looking at how they survive basically in terms of what changes have been made to their blood hemoglobin so that they can extract adequate oxygen from an extremely low oxygen environment. So that's what happened, you know, the respiratory system just makes that adaptation. The nature of hemoglobin changes so that oxygen intake becomes more suited to that environment. Melanin adapts to the sun. We know this. Sometimes for good, sometimes not for good. If you don't have enough melanin, then you're susceptible to sun damage, and so on. The cardiovascular system adapts to exercise by training really hard in one aerobic activity. You're better prepared to do another aerobic activity, not because you've transferred anything about that activity, but because the underlying system is available in both activities, and so both are changed. So the adaptations that I'm talking about lead to underlying changes in general systems that have multiple responsibilities. It's not an A to B transfer thing. And when these underlying systems change, that system is better to deal with particular environments. And so bilingual environments are very interesting. They are linguistically complex. They require constant monitoring. They require new ways of attending to the language in the environment because they impose a whole new layer of variability. So bilingual environments are linguistically complex. And my argument is that the attention system adapts to the demands of those environments. So here's another cartoon way of thinking about it. Here's a bilingual environment into which you put some cognitive system. So a cognitive system has an attention ability that's responsible for a whole range of things. Attention underlies lots and lots of things. And if you change attention, therefore, by definition, you're going to change the performance on all four of these skills. And my argument is that this attention itself is changed because it's in this bilingual soup. So we're not changing these four skills, we're changing underlying attention. However, we now know, and this is because of some of you out there who've done such important work on this, bilingual environments are not the same. And we're beginning, thanks to much of your research, to understand what the important differences are between bilingual environments. So in this story, if the bilingual environment is modifying attention, which then is reflected in all these skills, different particular bilingual environments will adapt attention in slightly different ways. Here's a different bilingual environment. And we need to specify these differences. And this is one of the really important contributions of the adaptive control hypothesis, where they set out very specific differences in how language is used and tied them to differences in how these brain networks might adapt to those different aspects. So the mechanism is the same. Something is being modified because it's dealing with a bilingual environment, but the level of detail takes it to the next step. What are the differences in different bilingual environments and how are they manifest in the adaptations? And if you take yet another bilingual environment, we can see that all of these changes in the specific nature of in the bilingual environment change the way the adaptation takes place. It's still an adaptation. We're still talking about modifying an underlying resource and then trying to measure the impact of that modification across observable tasks. But we are not ever trying to connect these specific skills with each other because the whole mechanism is just too broad for that. So let's go back to the map of the bilingual results. I said that the ones in these solid red lines really did not fit well with a transfer view. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think an important one is that the transfer view comes down to the need to say very specifically what particular skill transfers to what other skill. And the way that has been fleshed out in the bilingualism research is inhibition of a language or a language feature, the ability to inhibit a language or a language feature or lexical entry transfers to the ability to inhibit a perceptual feature. And I said these kinds of evidence for bilingual monolingual differences don't fit with that story. So let's look then at infants. I already mentioned that infants aren't speaking, so they're not inhibiting anything, but what are they doing? And the infant research is incredibly interesting. Infants can discriminate between two languages in their environment from at least 6 months on. This is very pre-verbal, but we know that they perceive two different languages. They can even do it when they're watching soundless videos of somebody speaking one language and then switching to the other. They know when the language switch happens, even without sound. So they're discriminating languages in their environment in a way that monolingual infants obviously don't need to. They can monitor their environment and keep track of language. So even before they start using language, they're responding to a more complex linguistic environment. And this complexity is handled by attention. So the kinds of differences we see between infants in monolingual and bilingual environments are shown with how they respond to visual language, how they scan faces for information about language, how they perform simple visual attention tasks, and then there's other examples as well. All of these are attention tasks where they need to know where to look. And within the first year, infants who are being raised in a bilingual environment are better than monolingual infants knowing where to look for the important information. That's attention. That's all it is. It's not language ability, it's attention. What about older adults, and particularly older adults with dementia? It's hard to say that a lifetime of inhibiting chien when you meant to say dog is going to be responsible for the really substantial cognitive reserve that we find in older adults. But it could be explained by saying that a lifetime of having a more efficient brain, defined in the ways I showed you in those two studies, means that at end of life, in older age, even with neurodegenerative disease, you still need fewer resources to do the same task because the brain is more generally efficient. And so you can plug along longer. That would be the cognitive reserve argument. So they can cope with declining cognition, even with neurodegenerative disease, because the brain needs less fuel, less energy. It's a more efficient brain, and it got that way because it has spent a lifetime adapting to a complex bilingual environment. And finally, the brain imaging results. These are interesting because there was an argument some time ago that some argued that if behavioral results are the same, then don't even look at the brain because there's nothing to see here. This argument was put out around the time people were beginning to report with a large number of studies reporting young adults doing standard executive functioning tasks had similar behavioral outcomes. There's other reasons for that, but that's not what I'm going to be talking about. And so they'd say, why are you even looking at ERP and fMRI? The results are the same, nothing to see here. But I think that's backwards, because it's only when the behavioral results are exactly the same you can really understand all the brain differences that have been found. And as I said, everywhere you look, there are brain differences. So again, the idea here is that this constant experience in a bilingual environment is modifying attention systems. And that may or may not show up in behavioral results. It just depends if you're being asked to walk or jog or run. But those systems are changing. And the real payoff comes in older age when the pressures on the system increase and possibly even enter into neuropathology. So the adaptation view has no problem with these kinds of results. Now, I've been saying it's attention, and I also admitted earlier, I'm just going to call it attention. But there is one study that I find very compelling that actually asked this question. So it turns out that if you use X-Gaussian analyses on behavioral data, you can distinguish between inhibition and attention. And I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to show you the results. Do not ask me about them. I understand nothing about the method. It's just the result, okay? So I trust people who know how to do this. So X-Gaussian analyses look at the tails of the distributions, not just the mean scores, which is what our parametric analyses are obsessed with. But if you look at the tails, you get a different kind of information. So Zhu and Krot looked at about 50 monolingual and 50 bilingual young adults, good sample size, and they did Stroop, Flanker, and Simon tasks, and there was no RT difference if you look at parametric analyses of mean RTs. No difference. We've seen this a lot in the literature. But they didn't stop there. They did these analyses of the tails. So it turns out that inhibition shows up as a larger mu function. And again, I do not know how these things are calculated, but I'm going to show you the data anyway. So that means that if you're comparing congruent and incongruent trials, you should have a larger mu on incongruent trials because there's some kind of inhibition happening there, right? And here are the results. So Flanker, Stroop, and Simon. These are the mu scores for Flanker, Stroop, and Simon. Monolinguals are filled, bilinguals are empty, and the congruent is the first pair of bars, incongruent is the second pair of bars. So if you go through this carefully, you'll see for each task, the pair of bars reporting mu for the incongruent trials are always substantially higher than those for the congruent. And when you compare monolinguals and bilinguals, there's absolutely no difference. So if you're just looking at inhibition, you have a congruency effect. There is no language group effect. Now, attention, they argue, is indicated through tau. And specifically, tau is smaller when a goal is maintained. When attention is better, it's focused, then tau is reduced, less effort, okay? So a smaller tau shows less effort. So here are the results again: Flanker, Stroop, Simon, monolinguals, solid bars, bilingual, empty bars, and again, congruent, incongruent. And now there's very little going on between congruent and incongruent trials, but look at monolingual and bilingual differences in every single comparison. The monolinguals are requiring far more effort than the bilinguals. So the bilinguals have better goal maintenance, better attention. So let's again look at these two concepts: adaptation of attention versus transfer of inhibition. They sound very similar, but I'm arguing that do not be misled by how they sound similar. So if we look at a graph in which we have 4 different tasks or 4 conditions, we can describe the tasks in terms of their degree of attention. This is like the NBAC I showed you, that we can go from 0 to 3 on essentially the same task, difficulty. Or we can describe them in terms of degree of similarity. This is what most of the literature does. Stroop, Simon, and Flanker, they're all kind of similar. We expect the same results. In fact, this has been argued that the results for Stroop, Simon, and Flanker must be similar for the bilingualism story to hold up. Now, if transfer is based on similarity, then we expect differences. I think I've just done this slide incorrectly. I'm going to put up the next. Right, transfer is based on similarity. Then the same task should have more or less the same outcome. So an easy version of Stroop should be the same as a harder version of the Stroop, because it's all about transferring that process you need to perform the Stroop task. Instead, if the similarity is based on adaptation, if the performance is based on adaptation, then what we should find is difficulty is determining what's similar. So 2 hard problems should be more similar than an easy problem and a hard problem, because it's about how many resources are available, not what specific process has transferred. So let's go back to the beginning. What happens in bilingual minds? So we had this process that we know is going on, whereby bilinguals are constantly dealing with the joint activation of 2 language systems. And there are implications of that system. At the same time, there are modifications in cognitive behavior that are attributable to whatever's going on in bilingual mind. Are they related? Well, I'm going to say yes, but not directly. Both are affected by more efficient attention. There is no transfer. Now, I want to insert one other comment here. I've been told that I'm not saying anything different, because isn't this all just transfer? And it's not. And I'm trying to say something very different from transfer. And the reason it seems easy to say that is because the word transfer has two kinds of meanings. It has the very specific meaning used in cognitive psychology and in the bilingualism literature, in which some process is repurposed to use in a new context, but it's the same process. And so if it's been built up, it can be applied to a new context. But transfer in general use means overlap. And if you take the broad, non-technical meaning of overlap, then of course, everything is transfer. There's no limits on what couldn't be described as transfer because everything overlaps in some way. So in the adaptation view that I'm arguing here, there's a lot of overlap between these systems. There's overlap between the attention system and what it does to language processing and Stroop performance. But there's no transfer. Because in the technical view of transfer, you have to be able to trace precisely a movement of process A in context 1 to context 2. Transfer in the most general meaning just means there's some similarity here. So we can't be misled by the non-specific general use of language. This is not transfer. It's a mechanism that goes outside of that domain and looks at how broad-scale systems respond to environments. And it is used. I have just finished reading a tremendously interesting book by Marianne Wolf, which I strongly recommend. She has 2 books that are both terrific, on how the reading mind adapts to reading. And she argues that both historically, since Sumerians first interacted with print, and ontogenetically, as children learn to read, their brains adapt to the very particular and bizarre needs of reading, and in so doing, those brains change. And her argument is that brains are incredibly plastic and respond to experience. This is just another example of that. So my conclusions are that exposure to a complex linguistic environment, just the exposure, leads to attentional changes across the lifespan and across systems. There is no specific connection between a specific task or process and some particular outcome. And experience in bilingual environments, this is my story now, leads to an adaptation in an underlying resource that is essential to all of human cognition. This is what we mean by experience-dependent plasticity. Thank you.